All right, in part one of the video on climate and community interaction, we were talking about the importance of just understanding why organisms need to live in a specific area so that they can maintain homeostasis. And if the conditions in a particular area don't meet their needs, then they can start to become stressed. And so it's important for organisms to be able to be tolerant of one another. However, if that tolerance is tested, then organisms might start to compete. And so according to your textbook, competition is described as when organisms attempt to use the same resources in the same place at the same time. An example of this dealing with humans would be if, let's say, you lived along the coast and a hurricane was headed your way. All of the human beings that have houses along there would probably run to a Home Depot or Menards, and they'd all want plywood. They'd all probably want some water. They would all probably get everything they need to kind of secure their house before the storm hits. Well, they're going to be competing for the same resources, just like animals in the wild might be competing for the same food source if one becomes scarce. Or an animal might compete for mating rights. And so there's a lot of examples of this that happen, and competition can actually occur among the same species or different ones. And so there's something that's called intraspecific competition and interspecific competition. The root intra means within. And so within a species, you have competition, which means it's competition amongst the same species in the same place. For example, black bears. They're living in the same area. They want the same food. And if that food source becomes scarce, they're going to have to fight each other for it. If they want to reproduce, they might chase after the same female, and those male bears would have to try to duke it out. Versus interspecific competition is competition among different species in the same area or habitat. An example of this might be orangutans and the gibbons that live in the same rainforest in Borneo. They're different organisms. They're going to eat slightly different foods, but they may compete over simply space. And so their competition is going to be for probably slightly different reasons, or it could be the same. Your textbook describes the fact that resources are not unlimited, which I don't really like. It sounds like a double negative. Another way to say that is that resources are limited. There's only a certain amount of food to go around. There's only a certain amount of space for organisms to live, for them to get shelter, for them to find a mate. This is no different than humans versus animals in the wild. We're finding right now there's a shortage of baby formula for people on this planet. There definitely is a shortage of space for people to live. And so we as human beings are facing this too. And so a question that I came up with that I thought was interesting for you guys is, do you think intraspecific competition within one species is more intense? Or do you think interspecific competition between different species is more intense? And why do you think that would be? The answer, I'm giving you a little bit of time to think about it. It's intraspecific competition is usually more intense. I guess it says it up here. I misread it. Sorry. But members of the same species usually occupy the same space and same habitat. So they're fighting for the same resources. And as a result, it becomes much more dangerous. And usually organisms use their life out in the wild because of this. And so that brings up another relationship of, are you a predator or are you a prey out in the wild? It's a relationship where one animal captures and feeds off of another. And so The amount of predators in an area determine the size of a population and where the prey can live and feed off of. And those predators may drive other animals out of an area as a result of them wanting food, or they can certainly cause a shift in the dynamics of the food chain and food web that exists. And so if you're interested in this, I'm just going to post the notes. You could watch this video. It's actually kind of interesting to show you the relationship between predator versus prey versus lions and hyenas. It's an older video, but I think it's a pretty interesting one. Otherwise, there's other relationships that happen out in the wild as well. Herbivores, organisms that eat plants, can affect both the size and distribution of plant populations in a community. This is called herbivory. And so we were talking about the importance of these primary producers that provide food for other organisms, and herbivores can affect the size and distribution of plant populations, like, for example, in Wyoming. Yellowstone National Park has faced this problem, and it's slowly starting to get better. For years, as you saw and watched the videos earlier, that the wolf population went down in Yellowstone, and as a result, the moose population went up. Normally, wolves are the predators, and a moose would be the prey. So if the wolf population was strong, they would be able to keep the moose population intact. Well, the wolf population went down, and as a result, the moose population flourished. And you would say, okay, well, big deal. What does that mean if there's a lot of moose in an area? Well, the moose like to feed off of plants, and they start eating away here along the river stream, and then that causes erosion problems. And so Yellowstone was seeing a ton of erosion, and slowly but surely they were able to bring the wolf population back up, which brought the moose population back down, and then the erosion problems went away. And so the point of this and sharing this with you is that when something happens to one group of organisms, it definitely has kind of that domino effect and affects others, which brings us to this idea of a keystone species. What is a keystone species? A keystone species is an organism, a single species, that has kind of this large effect on how the rest of that community or ecosystem operates. An example of this that your book described was the sea otters. The sea otters are animals that live in the ocean, and they tend to eat sea urchins. And the sea urchins eat kelp, which is these big giant algae that exist in the ocean. Well, fishermen were getting annoyed with these sea otters when fishermen would go out in the deep sea to try to catch fish, so they would start to kill the sea otters every time they saw them. And they thought, okay, that's not a big deal. Well, it turned into a huge problem because these fishermen all of a sudden just started to go out to these areas, and then they saw a dramatic increase in the sea urchins that were there. Because the sea otters died, these guys were flourishing, and they were eating all of the kelp in the ocean. And then you have to stop and think, well, how does that affect that area, that community? Well, the kelp are producers. They can make their own food, right? Using the light coming from the sun, as this picture shows. And they provide oxygen for the fish. So the fishermen that were going out to these areas to try to capture fish so that they could sell them and make money were finding all of a sudden the fish were dying in that area because it wasn't oxygenated, because the kelp were getting eaten by the sea urchins, because the fishermen were killing the sea otters. The sea otters would be considered then the keystone species. And so once the fishermen realized this, they stopped doing what they were doing. And so what this does is kind of get us to jump to this idea is that there's a relationship going on between these organisms. And so when you look at this word symbiosis, sys is the action or process of life coming together. So what does that mean? When two species live close together in an area, they develop a relationship, much like you and your friends. And there's 3 different kinds of relationships that can exist. Mutualism, where both organisms benefit. Parasitism, where one organism benefits and the other one is harmed. And commensalism, where one benefits and one is kind of neutral. An example of mutualism would be this example from Finding Nemo, the sea anemone and the clownfish. The clownfish can live within the sea anemone because it has this kind of coating over it, and it doesn't get stung by the sea anemone, which normally all other organisms do and become paralyzed. So the sea anemone is providing a place for the fish to live, and the fish are attracting other animals to it, but they're not going to get hurt. So the fish get food from the sea anemone when they sting and start to eat other animals, because yes, there's a mouth in here. And then the sea anemone provides shelter for the fish. And so it's kind of a win-win situation. Mutualism, another example, would be the goby fish and the shrimp. If you stop this and go to the notes, there's a really cool video that I put on here on YouTube that shows how they help one another. The goby fish protects the shrimp while it cleans and makes a home for the goby to live. The problem is the goby fish is a large animal and needs to find protection inside of there, and the shrimp scoops it out for them. And there's a reason for that, but I'm going to leave it up to you to find out from watching this video. Another example of a symbiotic relationship would be parasitism. One organism lives inside of another organism, and so one organism is benefited when the other is harmed. The example here is a dog and a tapeworm. When the tapeworm is inside of the dog, it lives off of the food that the dog eats, so it's helped, but it causes issues for the dog and can cause them to become sick. And there's a whole entire life cycle that can happen inside of the dog where it can create more and more worms inside of the animal. And really, truly, the only way to get tapeworms out is to have surgery. Here's a picture of a tapeworm found in a human. You can try to pull them out, but if that worm breaks anywhere along here and even part of it stays inside, it can then produce eggs and it can just continue to grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger. So you have to get these surgically removed, which is nasty. And the last type of symbiotic relationship is something that is called commensalism, where one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. A great example, a common example of this is whales out in the ocean and barnacles. The whales provide a place for the barnacles to attach, so the barnacles basically get a free ride along the ocean or within the ocean, and anytime the whale eats, there's tiny little food particles that fall alongside of the whale, and the barnacles can eat it up. So the barnacles are benefiting because the whale is providing food for them and transportation, but it's not harming the whale in any way, so it's neutral. The whale doesn't benefit either. It doesn't really serve them any purpose, but they're not harmed. So that would be an example of commensalism. And so there's kind of a fun song that kind of describes these. If you want to look at this video, you can. Otherwise, you certainly don't have to. And here's just kind of a visual that describes all of these symbiotic relationships, where two organisms live in a small area and help each other out, and they both benefit. That's mutualism. Parasitism, where one lives inside another, for example, or gets a benefit from one and the other is harmed, like a wood tick can get food from us but can cause us to become sick and we get a disease. That would be parasitism. And commensalism, where one is helped and the other is neither helped nor harmed. We're going to talk more about all of this information in part 1 and part 2 of these videos on climate and community interaction in the next couple of days. So if you guys have any questions, maybe write them down and then we can answer them in class. Thanks.